Okay, hi everyone. We're here to talk about the census. This is what the booklet looks like. It runs to 60 pages, very long, and not everyone has time to read 60 pages. But Barnaby and I are going to talk you through the main findings. Now, the first important thing to note is that the data collection, whilst this was published in April, the data collection refers to the 16th of January. And in fact, every year the census data collection runs on the third Thursday of January. So this data set is pre-pandemic, which seems strange now to think of a world pre-pandemic, and perhaps what will be more interesting is next year's census. So I guess what this year's report is a sort of baseline to what the effects of the pandemic has had on the sector. So we'll see next April. Now, it's a very robust, the census has been running for many years, first run in 1974. Not all data points were around then, but all the key ones, pupil numbers, boarding pupils, overseas pupils, fees. So a really rich data set, covers a range of topics, and we'll take you through each one in turn. And then the final sort of overview point to note about the census is that it covers ISC schools. So not all independent schools, and in fact, we only cover around 50% of all independent schools in the UK. However, we tend to cover the larger ones. So actually, we cover around 80% of pupils, so the vast majority of pupils in independent schools in the UK.
Well done, Donna. You've got to learn how to say the word pandemic. So, Donna, can you just tell us, what is the census mainly used for?
Well, it's used for many reasons, internally and externally. So we use it to track trends across the range of topics, really. Pupil numbers, where pupils are going, what types of schools, is it boarding schools, is it single-sex schools? We use it to track fees. We use it to see the level to which our schools are offering bursaries, partnerships, scholarships, where our pupils go to university. So, we use it to track all these trends. We use it, the media, I suppose, use it to help them sort of understand the sector as well. We use it to speak to the government about our sector, because there are often myths around what our schools are and what they're about. And this is a definitive data set that allows us to be really clear what our sector is and what it stands for. Yeah,
absolutely. It allows us to push back against myths, essentially, myths that sometimes people like to spread about our schools. Anyway, and sometimes, frankly, it's good news and sometimes it's bad news, but we put it out anyway. So one bit of relatively good news this year was that the number of pupils in our schools reached a record level, 537,000 at 1,374 schools. So that was the largest number of pupils since records began in 1974, which I think was pretty amazing, really, considering the financial and political pressures that our schools faced. And a reminder, really, that independent schools are still pretty popular. They're suffering at the moment, but they're popular. And that's not surprising when you look at the exam results and, the vast amount of energy committed to extracurricular activity. The other thing that I find interesting is that, the numbers in our schools go up and down in different regions. Some areas it goes up, some areas it goes down. I mean, it went down a little bit this year in the southwest and Midlands, Wales, Yorkshire and Humberside and the northeast. Went up in other areas. That's quite normal. And the other thing I think is really important for anyone listening to this is to understand that the average school size in ISC is only 390. So, there are lots of really very small schools, some quite big ones, but the average school is pretty small. There were nearly 30,000 overseas pupils, which means pupils who live abroad. So that's about 5.5% of all pupils, rather less than that if you take out the international schools. The largest group coming from China and Hong Kong. So, we know that with COVID-19, there's going to be a really big fall probably in that group next year. Let's hope it doesn't go beyond that, but there is going to be a decline. The other thing that was interesting from this census was that there was an 11% increase in the number of pupils coming from the European Union. So Brexit, you know, hasn't done too much damage there. In terms of boarding, of the 537,000 pupils, nearly 70,000 were boarders, 13%. And that actually went up a bit since the previous year, which is perhaps surprising. It's good. And if you consider pupils who boarded at any time during last academic year, there were about 74,000. While full boarding is obviously the most popular type still, there's been a bit of an increase in recent years in weekly and flexi boarding, and the proportion weekly and flexi has gone up a bit, and at the moment it stands at about 20% of the total. The other thing I always find very interesting is the proportion of our pupils who come from an ethnic minority, given that, you know, so often our schools are stereotyped at being white, rich children. Well, the proportion of minority ethnic pupils this year was 34.9%, up from last year, and of course, to some extent, reflecting general population trends. Anyway, those are the numbers that I find interesting. Over to you.
Yeah, and that's all correct. And the boarding one in particular, I agree, is very interesting, the increase in flexi boarding. Actually, the increase is really quite big this year, from about 17% 2 years ago to 20% of all boarders are now flexi boarders. And I think it sort of reflects, you know, boarding schools responding to the modern family. So, you know, working parents who might work part-time really value the flexibility of having their child boarding Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, but actually value them being at home for the long weekend. And then the other point to know, because you talked about different subsets of pupils there. So we have the overseas pupils, so these are the pupils that will come over and typically board in our schools, but then also there's all these families, they'll all come together, and the child will go to our schools, and that's where we're seeing the big increase in the EU pupils, actually, because we tend to have less EU pupils come to board, but lots of EU families come into the UK and using our schools. And you're right, it's really interesting in light of Brexit. Another subset of pupils, we've not touched upon yet, are single sex schools. So around a quarter of all pupils in ISC schools are attending a single sex school. There are more single sex girls schools than boys schools, and the single sex girls schools tend to be bigger. So there are a lot more single sex girls, if that makes sense, than single sex boys. And then what that means, just by deduction, is that, you know, the co-ed schools tend to be weighted more towards boys. And these are the sort of things that we track and capture in the census. And then the other subset of pupils that we gather data on are pupils with special educational needs or disabilities. There are around 87,000, which is quite a lot out of just over 500,000. The majority are some sort of specific learning difficulties, such as dyslexia. But, you know, again, we've got the, you know, the range of special needs and disabilities in our schools, and our schools typically have, you know, dedicated SENGO coordinators to work with these pupils. But I think that's the main. I think that's the subset of pupils. Barnaby, was there anything you wanted to add to that bit?
Well, I always think that those two things you've just talked about, single sex and special educational needs, are areas where independent schools are filling in a gap, really, in the provision made by the state. Because, you know, a lot of those special educational needs schools are pupils that are fully or part funded by local authorities, actually, but the state just doesn't have those schools, so independent schools fit in. And single sex is the same. You know, there just aren't very many single sex schools in the state sector now. And I think it's just great that, you know, I know that the world is divided into those who love single sex and hate single sex, but the fact is it's great that our schools give parents choice. That's the argument for it, you know, it gives them choice. And I think it's great that the girls' schools particularly have thrived in the way they have done. I'm going to say something about bursaries. So last year, our schools spent £440 million on means-tested bursaries and means-tested scholarships. That was about 44,000 pupils. and the average annual assistance per child was nearly 10,000 for the year. So that's a lot of children. We know that there's more to do. There are plenty of people who would like us to offer more big bursaries, and there are many, many schools, probably most actually, who would love to be offering more big bursaries. But given the financial pressures caused, not least by the huge increase in pension costs in that last year, these results are, if anything, a bit better than expected. I mean, COVID-19 is adding greatly to the financial strain, because many schools have had to cut their fees, so they've got less income. They're still having to pay their teachers, and it's quite possible that we're going to be losing overseas borders, and some parents may find that they can't pay the full fee. And so, COVID is going to undoubtedly limit the ability of schools to carry on increasing bursary provision, particularly because bursaries are so expensive. And most schools, the great majority of independent schools, just don't have any money in the bank waiting to be used for these things. But nevertheless, all our schools are committed to bursary provision. As for fees, remember, most of our schools are day schools. The average annual fee in a day school is £15,000. That's the average. So half the schools charge less than 15,000. 15,000 is a large amount, but it's not the 40,000 which so many journalists choose to quote, which is the fee of the most expensive full boarding schools, where you're basically paying for a kind of hotel experience. And the fee increase last year was, relatively modest. I mean, I can remember that in 2004, pension and national insurance costs increased by about 11%, and average fees went up by more than 9%. This year, the increased costs to our schools of the Teachers' Pension Scheme, well, I mean, I know plenty of schools where the increased cost has been £500,000 per year. And for many schools, that meant at least 2.5% on the fees. So along with a similar level of inflation, that would suggest a 5% increase in school fees would have happened, but the actual average fee increase was 4%. So I would still say that under these great financial pressures last year, our schools were controlling costs as much as they could. But of course, there are many costs where they frankly just didn't have control. But it still remains the ambition of every school I know in the independent sector to keep their fees down.
Yeah, and that's right. And you're right. It's almost remarkable, really, that the fees were held at only 4.1%, given the huge increases in costs of the TPS and relative, like you said, to the experience in 1994. But yes, like I said earlier, that this census refers to a time pre-pandemic, and it'll be really interesting to see what it reveals next year, because schools are committed to offering bursaries, and that as finances get more and more pressured, then it's going to become harder for schools. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the outcome is, because schools are committed to public benefit, full stop. So it's not just about bursaries, but partnerships. So the vast majorities of ISC schools are in some sort of partnership with state schools, and they're often in multiple partnerships with multiple different state schools. So in fact, it's 1,169 of our schools are in some sort of partnership, and collectively they are running over 12,000 partnerships with local state schools, and that's up on last year, which was just over 11,000. And also what is encouraging, I suppose, as well, is that growth is coming from a lot of the meaningful partnerships. So, for example, our schools assisting with higher education entrance, whether it be exam practice or interview practice. Last year, there were 187 of our schools that were running those kinds of schemes, and this year's 210. And that's considered quite a meaningful partnership. Another one is seconding pupils for academic purposes. So, for example, you might second some older pupils to go read with some reception-aged children in a local state school. That's another partnership area that's up this year. So it was 233 schools were doing that last year. this year's 279. Yeah, schools are really committed to their public benefit, and where not just financially via bursaries, but with time, because a lot of these partnerships take time and resource. So that's encouraging. And even beyond partnerships, they raising money for charity. Over £11 million was raised for charities this year, and also volunteering opportunities. Nearly 1,000 of our schools arrange some sort of volunteering opportunity. So that just demonstrates the commitment, I suppose, you spoke about, Barnaby, to public benefit and making a difference.
Yeah, I'm so pleased that those numbers are moving in the right direction. As you say, it's pretty unusual these days to come across an independent school that doesn't have a partnership of one sort or another, and some of them are devoting a vast amount of time and resources to them, and well done them. The other thing that struck me looking at the census was the continued increase in the number of ISC schools operating campuses overseas, and there are now 69 of them, educating 46,500 pupils, up from 39,000 last year. So, and the reason these are important is because the income from these schools goes towards keeping fee increases down and funding bursaries and partnerships. I mean, that's what the money is for. So it's wonderful to see that these overseas branches, again, a huge amount of work for the schools who have set them up, but it's wonderful to see them thriving and generating the money which is being used for great purposes, particularly bursaries.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it was a year or two ago when the number of pupils in overseas schools outstripped the number of overseas pupils coming to our schools, showing the significant growth that's happened in that market over the last few years. That's exactly correct. I might move on now to some other topics in the census. So the exam results, you might have noticed there's a section in there on exam results. So the thing to note there is that this comes from a separate data set. It comes from a data set that the Department for Education released. Now, ISC does an exam collection in August, but we collect a basic exam collection, so breakdown of grades by gender. But the Department for Education released a more detailed data set and split everything by subject. And that comes out in January. And in January is when we're right in the middle of doing all the census analysis. So it seems like a perfect opportunity to analyse that data as well. And we tend to put the main findings in the census report. Probably one of the key findings from that data set is how independent schools are overrepresented in some subjects and consequently underrepresented in other subjects. Now, if I just paint a picture here, in the pupils in the UK taking A-levels, around 16% of them are in independent schools, 84% of them are in state-funded schools. So you'd expect in any given subject for that split to always be 16-84, but in fact it's not. Okay, so for example, 30% of pupils taking further maths are in our schools. So there's one subject there where independent schools are overrepresented, and there are others. So classics is another one, maybe quite obvious. Modern foreign languages is another area that our pupils are overrepresented. Physics, chemistry, music, and drama. But like I said, there are subjects for which state pupils are overrepresented. Law is one. Biology happens to be one. But yeah, it's interesting to see that's a sort of split and how actually independent schools are helping to prop up, I suppose, a lot of the key STEM subjects and arts, which I think is interesting. And so that's probably one of the important findings from that data. The other is about the results. But I think this is probably more well known that typically pupils in independent schools do get better grades. Often, for example, in A-level, our pupils tend to get twice as many A's and A stars compared with state-funded schools. And then in this data set from the government, we can see how that looks by subjects, and the story is similar. 40% of independent pupils got an A or A star in A-level biology compared to 22% of state entries. And remember here that yes, not all our schools are academically selective. In fact, fewer than 50% are, because that's often a pushback against this finding. Another finding that we looked at in the exam section of the census is IB, and I find this one really interesting because we can compare globally. It's not just about how we stand in the UK, it's how our schools are faring globally. And those of you that know the IB will know that achieving 40 points is considered very high. And globally, only 10% of pupils achieve that 40-point mark. In our schools, it's 30%, so 3 times as many. So again, just shows that our schools are really achieving on a global scale and not just in the UK.
Incredible. And I think, you know, if you put together the 2 points that you made, which is that we're disproportionately doing some subjects like classics and maths and so on, and getting good results, what it means is that our schools are actually propping up quite a lot of university departments, and that, you know, university departments of subjects like classics, increasingly modern languages, but also sciences and, as you mentioned, music. Those university departments would be closed without the commitment that our schools have to teaching their subject, which has otherwise struggled a bit in the state sector. So I just want to finish by thanking the schools for completing the census forms. There's a lot of work for them. And thank everyone who works in the ISC Research Department, and particularly Donna, who has overseen the census for the last 5 years and is now leaving us. But she's only going to the Girls' Schools Association, so we'll continue to see her around and about. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.